The Rebel Capitalist Show. All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome someone to the Rebel Capitalist Show that I've not yet spoken to, but I've really looked forward to this conversation. I heard her first on my good buddy Chris Irons' podcast, the Quote the Raven, QTR. And as soon as I heard that, I texted and I said, oh man, can you please get me in touch with Whitney? Because I'd love to have her on the Rebel Capitalist Show. So here she is, Whitney Webb. Welcome to the Rebel Capitalist Show.
Hi, thanks. It's my pleasure to be here.
So for my viewers who don't know your backstory, can you get us up to speed on that before we start the conversation?
Yeah, so I mean, basically, most people know me from an Jeffrey Epstein series I did at the end or latter half, rather, of 2019 that went viral. But I published that at Mint Press News, where I was at that time the senior investigative reporter, but prior to that was their staff writer, and I've been writing for them since the beginning of 2017. I left at the beginning of 2020. I set up my own website called Unlimited Hangout, and I also contribute to The Last American Vagabond, which is mainly a YouTube channel, but the website also has articles including some of my contributions. Though I'm currently expecting my second baby, so I'm not doing quite as much now, because I do have my original Epstein series is going to be a book as well. So I'm working on that and doing my own site. So I don't have as much time for stuff on at The Last American Vagabond, but hopefully soon I'll be back to back to doing everything I'm used to doing, I guess you could say.
Is it fair to say you're kind of an investigative journalist for the libertarian movement or the freedom and liberty movement?
Well, I try to not put myself in a political label box, because that tends to, I'm basically trying, what I try and do is produce original investigative reporting that's just based on the facts and aims to appeal to people regardless of where they are in the political spectrum. Though a lot of the topics I do cover tend to be best received by, I guess, the freedom and liberty movement, if you want to say that. Because there are certain parts, I guess you could say, of the political spectrum that are adverse to some of the topics and issues that I write about. But
I was just speaking at the New Orleans Investment Conference last week, and it kind of dawns on you that today it's not really about Democrat, Republican, right, left, blue, red. It's really about, are you someone who believes in authoritarianism, or are you someone that believes in individualism? Because you can have Joe Rogan and Brett Weinstein that are, maybe on the left. Brett's probably far left, but they value individualism. And then you got someone like Ben Shapiro, who is on the conservative right, and they might not agree on a lot of things. But the one thing they are in full agreement on is the value of individualism and how we need to stand up and really fight authoritarianism.
Right. So I guess if I wanted to define myself, then I would say I'd put myself in the anti-authoritarian camp, because authoritarianism, as I see it, you can get from going to either extreme of the political spectrum. You can get that in an extreme leftist government or an extreme right-wing government. Ultimately, the thing I tend to oppose is authoritarianism and government overreach, the state in general. Maybe it's anarchist, I don't really know. People spend a lot of time getting caught up in labels, right? Which is why a lot of the stuff going on now, a lot of people, call it communist, other people call it fascist, and people are getting kind of lost in the weeds sometimes when it comes to these labels and vocabulary. But I think reducing it to sort of you're against authoritarianism is a little simpler for some people.
Yeah. What shaped your views?
Well, are you asking about the recent crisis or in general?
Well, just, you're someone that is anti-authoritarianism. Was there something specific, like you heard about the Ron Paul movement as an example, or you read Road to Serfdom, or it's just a bunch of these little things that kind of, you opened your eyes up to how the world really works, and you came to the conclusion that, hey, the individual should be the priority?
I don't think I can really boil it down to a very specific moment. I sort of, well, at least in terms of that aspect of it, Essentially what happened for me is that I had two events that happened early on in my life. I'm pretty young by by some people's standards. I'm 32. But when I was about 11 is when September 11th happened. And I sort of had questions about that from a pretty young age, at least about, certain prevailing aspects of the official narrative. And then when I went to university to college, I realized that just like history classes didn't even really scratch the surface of anything relevant,
Right.
And so I started, looking into that and was kind of amazed that there were certain things that were just completely omitted that seemed really important. Because, if you go to school in the U.S. public education system, as I did, the history courses on U.S. history breeze over the 20th century. They spend so much time on the 1700s and 1800s for a reason, and arguably the most important events of recent history that inform our present are just totally glossed over. So the more you start looking into that stuff, it becomes clear that you've been lied to about certain things. And then, what happened to me at that point is, well, how do things really work? And then you sort of realize who the powers that be are, what their aims are. And, it becomes kind of clear that they're to be opposed. So I guess you could say that was how I sort of came to hold those views in a sense, but it was, kind of a multi-year journey. I wouldn't really say it was like reading a particular book or a particular event, though it was 9/11 that set it off. But, I was pretty young, but I did see that a lot of things had changed and things just didn't make sense. The Iraq War, all of that stuff. The Bush administration maybe was the seminal event, and Dick Cheney, people like that, and putting me on this path. I don't know. I still don't like them. I didn't like them then, so maybe that's something that's a continuity between then and now.
All right. So enough of the YouTube PG-13 stuff. Now we want to get into some things such as the World Economic Forum, some of the medicines that we've been dealing with. So I want to let the viewers know that I'm going to have the editors kind of chop this up, and what's appropriate for YouTube, we're going to leave on this video. For those of you watching or listening to this that want more and to see the entire conversation, we're going to have that over on Odyssey, and we'll put a link in the description below. So let's just go ahead with the conversation, Whitney, and we'll see what we can keep on YouTube and what we have to move over to Odyssey. So let's start with the World Economic Forum. This is a group that I've kind of been focused on for quite some time. I don't think they're pulling all the strings. I think there's a lot of different variables, but how do you see them, and how much research have you done into what they do and kind of maybe what their motives are?
Okay, so I would sort of group the World Economic Forum within a network of organizations that are sort of like the global think tanks, right?
Right.
So you have the World Economic Forum, you have the Council on Foreign Relations, you have Chatham House in the UK, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You have a couple of different of these organizations that write policy papers and essentially make policy in a sense. And in the case of the World Economic Forum, more often than not, that policy somehow trickles down to become policy of governments around the world. Right. So the question is,
and corporations,
how does this,
and corporations.
Right, of course. So how does this happen and whatnot? And what's important to look at, for example, in the case of the World Economic Forum, is really, who runs them. So their board of trustees. You have the head of the IMF. You have prominent central bankers there. You have heads of some of the biggest tech companies of Silicon Valley.
Right.
You have people like Larry Fink of BlackRock. Very powerful people at the very top. Of course, you have Klaus Schwab, who created it, the World Economic Forum, in the early 70s, in close association with the Club of Rome, another one of sort of these global think tanks. The Club of Rome having longstanding ties to the Rockefeller family, and also their original paper that brought them to prominence, The Limits of Growth, is very much steeped in Malthusianism, and that was basically the topic. That was basically the topic of the World Economic Forum's first annual meeting that highlighted that paper.
And before we go any further, for the viewers who don't know what Malthusianism is, can you explain that? That's basically, there's not enough resources, so we probably got too many people.
Well, yeah. So it's essentially what the limits of growth argues is that, well, it's essentially what has been cemented as the prevailing climate change narrative today. But this was then back in the 70s, saying that, based on our calculations and models, I think they teamed up with some MIT guy or something. Can't quite remember the specific details, but they had allegedly modeled this all out, that there needed to be less people on the planet, or we were going to surpass the resource limit of nature and all of this. So actually that model was later proven wrong. And then the Club of Rome comes back in the 90s and talks about how this narrative needs to be continued anyway, despite the fact that their original model didn't actually hold up in the light of what actually transpired. Sort of like Al Gore saying, we're going to be all underwater by this year, and it didn't happen type prediction. So the Club of Rome was doing that well before Al Gore was. Al Gore, by the way, I think is also another trustee of the World Economic Forum. But you have a mix of central bankers, heads of corporations, former former heads of state. So you have a mix sort of you have a mix of the public and private sector, essentially. And it's no surprise that the World Economic Forum labels itself as the global promoter of public-private partnerships, which is essentially where the public sector works with the private sector on equal levels. And so essentially what comes from this is that you don't really have the public sector driving policy the way that we've been led to believe for so long that they do, that, the government creates the policy and we elect the government. And so, there's this participation there of the public. Well, really the policy is coming from these types of individuals through these think tanks that act through these think tanks. And then that sort of trickles down to governments, who then sort of enforce that policy. And then there's the people that sell that policy to the public.
So the politicians are the useful idiots.
Well, I think more often than not, they're there to sell policies or make people think that they're the ones creating it when they're not. I recently had Ian Davis of In This Together on my podcast, and he laid out a really brilliant hierarchy for how all where the World Economic Forum fits into all of this stuff. He calls it the global public-private partnership. Well, at the top he has the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of the central banks. Below that he has the central banks, and then he has the World Economic Forum and these other global think tanks. Below that he has, if I remember correctly, the policy distributors, which are groups like the IMF that say, okay, you want this aid package, you have to implement these policies. Right. Those policies coming from the policymakers above, and then essentially being foisted on the governments that require the aid package. But you could also say that, like, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for example, fits in that category as well, because they say, oh yeah, well, you want this many millions or hundreds of thousands of dollars of grants. You have to research this and that. You have to promote these things if you want this funding, type of thing. So these same, billionaire philanthropists often sort of fit in this cycle as well. And the government through the state, are the enforcement power. They can legislate it, and and then it's seen by the public. But oftentimes it takes place well before that point.
That's a great description. And I think what it highlights is the amount of power that goes to the corporations or these global elites that are heavily influencing the corporation, if they're able to control more of the share of the profits or the capital gains, and as far as stocks. And you just outlined it there, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But they always talk about stakeholder capitalism. I'm sure that's their buzzword, and they're always throwing Milton Friedman under the bus, right? We can't have this neoliberalism. We can't have shareholder capitalism. We got to have stakeholder capitalism. And it sounds great. Oh yes, these corporate entities should be doing good, for society, for our benefit. But what happens is, when you really dig into it, you see, well, wait a minute, this just gives them power over more of the profits that the corporation is generating, and it's going into fewer and fewer hands. Therefore, if they control where those billions and billions of dollars, if not trillions globally, go, then whoever's holding the purse strings then they have the power. And they're taking that away from the shareholders and giving it to the CEOs or whomever is influencing those CEOs.
Right. So stakeholder capitalism is really important to focus in on, but they're also coming up, they've been using a new buzzword lately, inclusive capitalism, which is their new word for it. There's actually a council on inclusive capitalism that's headed by the Pope now, that has a lot of the same World Economic Forum leaders, or people that are involved with the World Economic Forum and some other prominent members of the global elite, Lynn Forrester, de Rothschild, the Lauder family in the mix, the heads of Visa, MasterCard, the head of Salesforce, who's a very prominent member of the World Economic Forum, Mark Benioff.
He's like a disciple of Klaus. I always call him Klaus Mini-Me. He is. He's Mini-Me.
Yeah, he's a Klaus worshiper. It's worth mentioning, though, that Klaus's great mentor was Henry Kissinger. That's who got him in the game, apparently, if you believe him. You can look through his family history in an article on my website called Schwab Family Values on unlimitedhangout.com, and see about his father and the company he used to work for and all of that, if you're interested. For some of the more background there, but anyway, when he went to, I guess, Harvard Business School, he was taught by Kissinger, who he later described as one of his main mentors, which is interesting to say the very least, because Kissinger, I don't even really know where to start with that guy. Lots of decades of fuckery to talk about when it comes to him. But he's also involved in this effort to recreate the economic system as well, to an extent. Michael Bloomberg has created the New Economy Forum, I believe.
You're talking about stakeholder capitalism and why that's important.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, I was sort of talking about the different. I got off track talking about the different buzzwords, I guess. And different names they're calling for it. But essentially, there's this effort to create a new economic system that is stakeholder capitalism, but they're trying to rebrand it in different ways. Right. So they're calling it like inclusive capitalism, or like the new economy, the new, and all this stuff.
Is that Build Back Better, or is Build Back? What I see Build Back Better, it's just a rebranding of the Great Reset agenda, because they came out with that in like 2020, or it was before that, but they really started promoting it. It became popular in 2020, and they got so much pushback from the internet and just kind of all the normal people on the left and right. Like, okay, this isn't going to fly. So they kind of have to rebrand it as Build Back Better. And that's what you hear Biden and Trudeau talking about nonstop. So am I right to assume that?
Well, I think a lot of these different groups have different names for this thing.
Okay.
So the World Economic Forum's name is the Great Reset. The Rockefeller Foundation, I believe they call it the Great Transformation. And then the UN's name for it is Build Back Better. But oddly enough, back in 2010, the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum called the Global Redesign Process, which they began planning then with their Global Agenda Councils, they're called, which they have essentially for every facet of our lives, has a Global Agenda Council. Even the future has its own council with them. And those different groups have developed policy papers and policy agendas from now until like 2050 for all these different areas of society. And a lot of that is, coalesced with this 2030 agenda. That's why so many of these different groups that you see come together in manifesting these different agendas use that point to that particular year so often. So I think they all have different names for it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I don't know if I'm sure you read that paper by I think she was a Danish gal that is part of the World Economic Forum. She wrote that blog post about, it wasn't just you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. It was something to the effect of you'll own
rent
nothing,
everything.
you'll have no privacy. You'll
Yes,
own nothing,
also.
you'll have no privacy,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll be happy. And she goes, it really is just eerie, in the sense that it seems like it's written like by a third grader, because they're talking about having crayons and art projects, and they don't have to go to work because all the computers do everything, and all they have to do is ride their bicycle around and color and grow plants and stuff, and that the robots bring them anything they need, and the robots can read their thoughts, and that and then she goes on in the latter part of it and talks about those people who were kind of basically pro-freedom and didn't see things the way the government's
Yeah,
out
they
there,
like
how they
live
have to
in
live out in the world.
villages
Yeah, in
or
these
something.
villages out in
Yeah.
the woods, and then it turns into straight Hunger Games. What
Yeah.
was your takeaway from that?
Oh, I haven't read it in a while, but for the people that think that all this investment in automation, what they more broadly call the fourth industrial revolution,
Yeah.
all of that stuff. If you think that all these billionaires are and bankers are investing so much money and time in these services like Jeff Bezos automating Amazon, they're doing that so you can sit on your ass and paint all day and grow plants and like just have fun. You're totally deluded. That's not why they're doing it.
So why are they
at
doing
all. Well, essentially, there's a couple different reasons why they're doing it. One, from the perspective of someone like Jeff Bezos, it's a lot more profitable, right? Because you don't have to worry about, all these Amazon workers are trying to unionize, and we have to increase our wages, and we have to worry about their complaints about wanting health care. In the past couple of years, there's been a surge of movements, not just in the U.S., but other countries as well, with workers demanding more, but we've seen it in the US more recently, for sure. And obviously, the people at the heads of these corporations like Amazon, which is just the easiest example to use because it's like such a monopoly. In a lot of ways, look at that and they're like, oh, we don't like this. So it's much easier for them to invest in the upfront cost of a robot that does the same work as, potentially several people, a couple people. And then just have to pay for maintenance costs instead of having to worry about all these unknown variables that a human employee has for them. And it's also it doesn't complain. There's a lot of different things you could have there. It's also all interconnected, all automated. It reduces you don't really need human involvement for some of these tasks at the end of the day, essentially.
Yes, that's so where I take that in my head, because I always tend to see things through the lens of macroeconomics, and there's so many unknowns out there as far as the entities we're referring to, the global elite, World Economic Forum. But if you read what they say, the conclusion you have to draw is they're at the very best, they're central planners. At the very least, these people are Marxist. At the very least. And so then, from an economic standpoint, you say, okay, well, they look at Russia and say, well, what went wrong with communist Russia? Well, they didn't have something called price signals, so they can't allocate scarce resources with alternative uses efficiently. But if they have a central bank digital currency, let's assume, so all those transactions are in the same centralized database in real time, and they have that artificial intelligence that they talk about so much in the fourth industrial revolution. Now, all of a sudden, to your point, the robots or the artificial intelligence can go ahead and crunch this data and allocate those resources for us, so we can take control of those resources. We can have the means of production owned by the central planners and the governments. We don't have to have prices. We can let the artificial intelligence in this fourth industrial revolution give us the technology we need to really move into this socialist utopia. From a Marxist standpoint, do you think there's any merit in that, or have you thought that through?
Well, here's the catch. Artificial intelligence doesn't work as well as they say it does, and They know that. And so their plans hinge on so much running almost exclusively on artificial intelligence, because they want to control so many people.
Right.
So few people want to control so many people. They need to have some sort of automated system to do that. But a lot of their algorithms have very not great accuracy, right? And so the problem with that becomes, then that means our system won't work the way we want, and it won't. They need it to get better. Essentially, what they want to provoke is what they call the singularity, which is like super intelligent artificial intelligence that surpasses human intelligence, and is sort of like a these people sort of view it as a god. Essentially, if you read a lot of the artificial intelligence researchers, they sort of view it that way, but they haven't been able to trigger it. Right. So if you look more deeply into the writings of people like Klaus Schwab, who came up with the name Fourth Industrial Revolution, it's not just about automating stuff. It's also essentially about changing what it means to be human as well, in the sense of sort of merging us with the robots and the machines to an extent. Obviously, that involves lots of new opportunities for control, surveillance of thoughts, like that Dutch writer, member of the WEF, alluded to, but also other people that speak frequently at the World Economic Forum. Yuval Noah Harari have essentially said this, that we are at the precipice of the age of digital dictatorships. He said this at the 2020 Davos annual meeting, and essentially called on everyone in the room there to create that reality. It's a very
and also, Whitney, the Internet of Bodies. Do you want to explain that?
Well, that's essentially what this is related to. So essentially what Yuval Noah Harari says in that speech, and I would encourage people to go look it up because it's very disturbing. He says we're no longer human beings with a mysterious soul. We're now hackable animals. And at the point that we start wearing, he's saying this to the World Economic Forum. So, I mean, consider his audience, right? But he says essentially, with the rise of wearables, which is coming, we've seen it promoted pretty heavily, that will allow government surveillance, not just of what goes on outside, in the exterior, but also what goes on inside your body and in your thoughts. And once that happens, we pass into this whole age of digital dictatorships. And this whole thing with the wearables is also tied sort of to the Internet of Bodies, sort of like almost a hive mind perspective on our, not only will, your body be tied to the cloud through the wearable, but it will be linked to all the other people whose bodies are linked to the cloud. And isn't that great and whatever? I mean, it's very matrixy. And the fact that we've had just in the past month and a half, if you are a follower of tech news headlines, an explosion of mentions of the so-called Metaverse. I don't know if you've been following this, but Facebook recently, for example, has announced their rebrand from a social media company to a Metaverse company. And essentially the Metaverse is like the Matrix. It's existing in an alternative reality that is entirely virtual reality. While you're wearing the Oculus Rifts and you have these like dumb little circles in your hands. I mean, obviously that technology, they plan to have that evolve with time, but they want us to spend more and more of our time in that space. And I think that's why there's this also explosion in interest among some anyway, for NFTs. To sort of start, I would argue, just because it's so convenient for them, that a lot of the hype is probably manufactured around NFTs. That's my suspicion anyway, because it's creating interest in owning things in the metaverse and spending more time in the metaverse and buying objects that you can only use in the metaverse and you own there. And all of this stuff. So I think maybe that's an interesting way of looking at it in the context of this heavy promotion of these virtual reality things. I think that's only going to pick up with time.
Hi guys, I'd like to invite each and every one of you to the next Rebel Capitalist live event. If you are a fan of the Rebel Capitalist show, I guarantee you will love the live event. The next one is Houston, where you can meet and listen to speakers, all your favorites from the Rebel Capitalist show. People such as Dr. Ron Paul, Chris Cole, Lynn Alden, just to name a few. If you want to check out the rest of the speaker list and find out how you can attend, we'll put a link in the description below, or you can just go to rebelcapitalistlive.com. This is an event where you can learn to build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments. But it's not just about building wealth. It's about increasing your freedom and networking with like-minded individuals, fellow rebel capitalists. It's an amazing event. I know you'll absolutely love it. Check out rebelcapitalistlive.com. And I will see you in Houston.